Welcome to the Seattle Sports Union Podcast. My name is Abraham Deweese. I'm back again with a local Seattle legend, one Geoff Baker. I'm sorry, I always want to say Joff. I apologize. It's the way you spell it, man. But it's great to have you here. And we're going to talk a little bit of a little Kraken's hockey today. And I just want to say I've become a much bigger fan of this team than I thought I ever would have. And right off the bat, Jeff, I just want to ask you that playoffs has indoctrinated me. Do you feel you've got your pulse on the fans out there in Seattle, out here in Seattle? Do you feel like it's indoctrinated a lot of other people into this sport?
I think it's gotten them interested. I don't know that I would say indoctrinated just yet. I think they are definitely they've had their interest peaked. I think they realize there's a hockey team here now. I don't know if a lot of people realize that even before the playoffs took place. So far this regular season, they've had to compete with a Mariners playoff push. They've had to compete with the Huskies going for a national title. They've had to compete with the Seahawks, being first place in their division. It's a lot of and the Sounders, making the playoffs, doing what the Sounders always do, almost always. And so, a lot of competition here locally for sports eyeballs. And, I think the Kraken, like I said before, they've got some people noticing that they exist now, which is a really good step. But if they want to indoctrinate them, if they really want to reel those people in, they're going to have to keep playing at the level that they played at to get into the playoffs last season. Now, they haven't done that so far, but there's a lot of work ahead of them still. They have to reel some of these fans in for good now. They've got them hooked to a certain degree.
Awesome, thanks, Jeff. And I have more questions on that later, but I want to talk about the team right now here, the 23-24 season, and they're stumbling out of the gates. What accounts for this lethargy? I mean, they only have 4 wins. I can't put my finger on it. I'm curious what your take is on it.
They had a really tough start. I mean, they had a schedule that was probably the toughest in the National Hockey League. Their first 10 games, they had to play 7 games against playoff teams from last season, and then the 3 other games they had to play Detroit on the road, which is a red hot team at the time. Then they had to play the home openers of both the St. Louis Blues and the Nashville Predators on the road. And so that's a gauntlet you have to run, and that really set them back. I think that had a lot to do with their poor record. Now since that time, they've had some inconsistent play, and we saw this last season as well. They play a very, very tough system of play. It requires a lot of hard work, a lot of skating all the time, constant skating. And frankly, I think this team takes games off every now and then. We saw it last season. We saw it during the playoffs, certainly, where in the second round, where they would beat Dallas pretty handily one day, and then they would lose, pretty handily the next. And I think a
Right.
couple of times they've taken some nights off here so far, and that's cost them. So they have to pick it up, and it's tough. It's not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, I think that's what that kind of bothers me. So I see them I see them drop a game to Edmonton. Doesn't bug me. When you drop a game to the Arizona Coyotes, that kind of raises my eyebrow.
Well, the Coyotes are actually off to a decent start
Are they?
this year. They've actually got a half decent team. Now, I don't think they're going to keep this up very much longer. I think they're going to run out of gas. Same with the Anaheim Ducks. They're the same kind of deal. But right now, the Coyotes are playing every game like it's Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Final, and so it's they're not an easy out, as they say in baseball. And in hockey, there's no real such thing as an easy draw in any professional sport. But they went in there. They probably should have beaten them in regulation time, and that's part of the problem. Kraken have had trouble scoring goals this season,
Yeah.
and there's only been a handful of games where they've scored more than 3 goals. And usually, more than 3 goals will get you a win. They only scored 3 against Arizona the other night. It wasn't enough. They went into overtime, couldn't score there. And then in the shootout, they're just terrible. They're a terrible shootout team, and so they lost that. They got the 1 point, and now they have to move on from that. When you can get a road point, it's not the worst thing in the world. Where they really have to improve is in some of their home games. A couple of their home performances this year at Climate Pledge Arena have just been dreadful, and so they really have to work on that.
I want to say they have 3 overtime games. Uh, and should we look at some positive in that they're keeping this tight? And those could, I mean, in hockey, I feel like overtime, sudden death can go one way or the other. It's not. It's not it's not a skill thing. It's just maybe who can get that one.
Well, technically, they've had 5 overtime games. 2 of them, nobody scored in overtime, so they had to go to a shootout, and they lost both of those. The 3 overtime games where there have been decisions, they've actually won 2 of them, and they lost the third one in the last 9 seconds. So they came close to doing okay in all 3 of those games. The problem, it's not really a problem. Where they had problems a year ago was a year ago, right around this time, that they didn't have enough puck possession in overtime. They didn't really have a strategy in overtime. They were just going up and down, looking to see whatever happened. Now they actually play a puck possession game. They have a strategy of trying to hog the puck throughout the overtime. And they'll do it even if they're not going to have a scoring chance in the other team's end. They'll bring the puck. You watch, they'll circle back, they'll bring it out to center ice, regroup, and try over again. What they don't want to do is give the puck up and have the other team have a chance to score. So they really try to maintain possession throughout the overtime and take their chances where they open up to them. And that's been a really successful strategy for them. I think they've won 11 of their last 13 regular season overtime games. I want to say something like that, or yeah, I think it's close to that. 11 out of 13 since they implemented that strategy exactly almost a year ago. Next week it'll be, and because they had lost a whole bunch of overtime games prior to that, so overtime has actually helped them. It's when the Kraken don't score in overtime that it gets problematic because they're terrible in the shootout. The 3 breakaways for each team. They simply can't score for whatever reason, and they've lost 6 of those in a row. So that's where they going back to last year. So they have to really um, buckle down and try to score in overtime.
I see a stat that's come up in basketball and hockey for personal performance, individual performance, and it's called the plus minus. I was curious, it is this one of those analytic stats that is just a reach, or is there something to it?
Plus minus has been around forever. Actually, it was around when I was a kid in the 1970s, and so it's definitely not one of these newfangled analytics stats. In fact, the analytics community doesn't really like that stat so much because they've come up with better means of judging a player. So what it is basically is how many goals you're on the ice for, and how many goals you're on the ice against. So if you're plus, that means if you got a +5, it means you've been on the ice for 5 more goals scored than goals scored against you. And generally that's a pretty good way to gauge things, except that it's a very team related stat. So if you're on the ice with terrible players, and then you're usually going to have a minus stat. You've had some of the best defensemen in the NHL that have terrible minus stats because they played for horrible hockey teams. And
Okay,
so, when it comes to that, that's not really the best way to gauge. It'll give you a quick look. So I would suggest, if you're looking at plus minus, look at who's on the plus side, who's on the minus side, but then you delve in deeper and you go to better stats than that on the analytics side to try to gauge things like that. There's stats like the Corsi stat. There's a bunch of other more complicated stats, but those start to delve into that realm a little bit better.
gotcha. So it's one of those maybe starting points, and then you need to look at it a little bit more, sort of like
Right.
WAR with baseball.
Yeah, yeah. Well, no, it's not at all like war. War is a far more sophisticated stat than plus minus.
Okay,
War would be, war is getting close to gauging like the direct value of a player, the true value of a player, and it's gotten to the point where people actually use it to compare players, which I'm still not a fan of. But it's gotten a lot more sophisticated than anything like plus minus. Plus minus would be a basic stat like batting average in baseball.
I see.
Um, batting average will tell you a few things. It'll tell you who can hit the ball, but it won't tell you, are they hitting a 16 hop ground ball through an infield, or are they hitting line drives? That it won't tell you. And so some of these more advanced analytic stats will go way beyond plus minus and way beyond batting average in baseball. So that's, I would say, a good comparison between the two.
Okay, great. Or like for our Mariners, hitting when it matters versus when you're down by 10 runs.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I talked to a lot of old baseball players, former base, not old because they're younger than me, a lot of them, but former baseball players, and they'll tell you hitting with runners in scoring position matters. And I mean, it does, because frankly, if you don't hit with runners in scoring position, the runners aren't going to score, and you're not going to win games. That's the bottom line. The question in baseball, stats wise, has always been whether or not that's a repeatable skill. Whether somebody's going up there with runners on second and third, and actually going to hit better, just because it's a clutch situation. And there's a lot of debate about that. There has been going on 2 decades now about whether a clutch stat like that is actually something that's a repeatable skill. And a lot
I
of
think
people will tell you it isn't. That good ball players will simply go up and hit the ball regardless of who's on base. And so it's a different way to look at things.
well, I think there's maybe a little bit of hero worship in that, right? Where you're looking at a pressure situation, and the knight on the horse is going to, face that dragon and defeat it, at the most important moment. And um,
So I'll tell you what, I grew up a Montreal Expos fan in Montreal, Canada. And in 1981, they were in the National League Championship Series playing the Dodgers. Game 5, it was only best of 5 back then, so the deciding game. And the Expos had the bases loaded with nobody out in, or sorry, they had runners on first and third with nobody out in the first inning against Fernando Valenzuela in the deciding game at home. And Andre Dawson, Hall of Famer, future Hall of Famer, all-time great hitter, great ball player, nice person, comes up to bat and grounds into a double play. He had a horrible series that year, especially with runners in scoring position, and you know that dogged him actually the rest of his career. That thing, but I mean, look, the guy's a Hall of Famer. Guy's broken records. The guy was a great two-way baseball player, and he didn't hit in the clutch there, and he didn't hit in the all-time clutch situation for that franchise because they never got that close to the World Series again. They lost again. They scored 1 run. He grounded in a double play, got the run across, so it was 1-0.
was
But
that
that let Fernando Valenzuela off the hook. They didn't give up another run the rest of the game, and Rick Monday hit the game-winning homer in the 9th inning to beat them 2-1. And
was
so,
that was that Fernando's rookie year?
yeah, that was his rookie year,
Yeah.
Fernando Mania. So, yeah, but Valenzuela back then, I mean, pitchers could go complete games. I think he pitched that one into. I can't remember if he pitched a complete game. He got into the 9th. He might have pitched a complete game in that one because the Expos, there was 2 outs. The Expos drew 2 walks, so they had runners on first and second. And then Jerry White grounded into a game-ending ground out at first base. But I think, or was it second base? I can't remember. It was a game-ending ground out. And but I can't remember if they brought the bullpen in at that point or if they let him finish the game. But yeah, he might have pitched a complete game. But
That's so
that
funny.
was beginning of the end for baseball in Montreal.
It's so funny you mentioned that because that was a you said that dogged the Hawks' career for the rest of his.
No, it didn't dog it. Look, the guy's a Hall of Famer. He went to Chicago,
I,
won the MVP with a terrible team. But the point is, like, you bring up the playoff, everybody will remember that one. They'll remember, oh yeah, he didn't do very well in that playoff. I mean, that was the one, check mark against his career. I would say was his performance in that NLCS. And
oh,
yeah,
right.
it was tough because the Dodgers went on and they won the World Series that year. The Expos probably would have won the World Series had they made it against the Yankees.
I remember why I asked you about the plus or minus now. I was going to ask about
I,
Matty.
I'll keep talking forever, and then you'll remember all kinds of things. You'll remember, the name of your first grade teacher by the time I'm done.
That maybe not, but the Matty Beniers actually has a really poor uh, plus or minus. I believe it was minus 16, and I was just trying to think to myself, as I watch him, he's been a little bit invisible this year, and I was wondering if you had any insight on that.
Yeah, it's got nothing to do with his plus minus, but I think, look, Matty Beniers is not taking anybody by surprise anymore. I think since about midway through last season, people have realized, this guy's pretty good. And that's why he won Rookie of the Year. So, and he's been marked. He's been getting, physically knocked around. He gives as good as he gets sometimes, although there's only so much you can give when you weigh 178 pounds. But he's trying. He's just getting physically manhandled at times, and I think that he got blindsided by Tyler Myers last year of the Canucks, and
For the All Star game.
it was a cheap shot, suffered a concussion. I
Yeah.
really don't think he's come all the way back from that yet, as far as production goes. I'm not inside his head. I don't know how he feels about the concussion. I don't know what he's feeling in his head, but I don't think he's quite the same player he was before that. That said, I think he's been unlucky at times this year. I mean, he hit the goalpost. I think it was against, I think he was playing Florida. He was like 20 feet away from the goalie. He had him dead to rights, beat him, puck rang off the post. I mean, that goal goes in, it might loosen him up a bit. Maybe it changes. Maybe he's got 3 goals by now. But look, he hasn't scored yet. And this isn't all that uncommon for second-year players. There's a lot of adjustments he's still making in the league. And one of the adjustments you have to make is guys see you coming now. And then some of them are very big guys. And, your teammates aren't always going to be there to have your back. And the Kraken aren't exactly a team, a bunch of goons like the mid-70s Flyers. They're sometimes passive, conscientious objectors, I guess you could call them. So, he's had to take a lot. He's taken a pounding. And I think that's got something to do with it.
So I believe that hit knocked him out of the All-Star game.
Yeah.
And there's that hit on McCann in the playoffs by the Avalanche.
Yeah.
Some of the criticism that I see, is that it's not a tough team. It's not a team with an enforcer. Are those days gone? Because I don't really know if teams have enforcers anymore.
Some teams do have designated enforcers, like Curtis McDermott of the Colorado Avalanche is an enforcer. Thing is, he doesn't play every game. He plays when they think there's going to be some rough stuff. They don't have enforcers like back in the day. No, I mean most of these players wouldn't last 5 seconds with a real enforcer from back in the day. It's not even worth discussing. They just wouldn't. And but it's different now. You have to be able to play hockey as well as fight. And so, whereas back in the day, everybody could fight. Rick Tocchet, coach of the Vancouver Canucks, was one of the better fighters out there, and he could score goals too. He's a good hockey player. But he would probably pass for an enforcer nowadays because he could really throw down. He could throw hands. Most of the players today, no, they're not the same. On the Kraken team, they don't really have a designated fighter per se. The closest thing they have to a fighter, a good fighter, is probably Will Borgen. Believe it or not, I don't see him lose very many fights. He usually ends up on top of the other guy, and but he's not somebody you would consider a typical enforcer. Jamie Oleksiak usually has to fight for the team. He hasn't really fought this year though. Last year it felt like he was fighting every other game, and that's not really his thing. He's a big guy, but it's not his thing. So they don't really have it. John Hayden in the minors would be the closest they have to an actual,
What was that name again?
John Hayden.
John Hagen. And he said Coachella?
He's at Coachella, but he's played in the NHL for a few teams quite a bit. And the one thing he does well in the NHL is fight. And he's a tough fourth line player too. He's a hard guy. He'll go in the corners. A lot of times he doesn't have to fight because guys don't want to fight him. And so, I wouldn't say he's an enforcer, a scary type enforcer like what they had back in the 80s and 70s. Not like that, but he's a guy who plays really hard, and he's a guy who can handle himself. He can fight. And he knows the code too. So this past preseason, you saw him getting a fight right away with Tyler Myers, the Canucks, because of that hit on Beniers. You didn't see that last season, though, when the Kraken went into Vancouver. They had a chance to settle the account, as they say, by themselves. They didn't do that. So they're not that kind of team. And where you need that in the NHL, though, is when other teams start playing that game with you. So fighting's not what it used to be in the NHL, but it still has a bit of a purpose, I think, in dissuading teams. The idea is you can't have teams taking runs at your players all the time. And if you're going to go out and you're going to run a guy and you're going to injure a guy, you have to be willing to put up with it and fight later on. Now, does it settle anything after the fact? Probably not. No. The whole idea is that you're supposed to dissuade guys from taking these runs and taking these cheap shots and police the game yourselves as players, because the NHL certainly doesn't do a very good job of it. They suspend guys for a game, for breaking a stick over somebody's head. So, I mean, that's kind of the whole logic and the thinking behind it. And so that's why Jordan Eberle had to fight 80 seconds into the first game they played against Colorado at Climate Pledge Arena, because last year in the playoffs, Jordan Eberle actually broke the vertebrae of Andrew Cogliano.
Oh, wow.
It was inadvertent, but he cross-checked him and from behind, and he ended up breaking his vertebrae. And so, that caused quite a bit of consternation amongst the Avalanche. And first chance they got, Eberle had to drop his gloves and fight. That's it's the way hockey's been for years.
There's a school of thought, though, if you reduce the quantity of fights, get the game moving faster, it might appeal to the short, today's audiences that, can't focus on things for too long.
I missed the first part of that. You got cut off audio-wise.
I was going to say, I was just trying to say that there's a school of thought, if you get rid of the fighting in hockey, it might be a more televisable game. I was curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I don't agree with that. I think some of the loudest crowds you hear at Climate Pledge Arena, some of the loudest, some of the noisiest the fans get there is when they think somebody's about to drop the gloves and fight. That's sometimes you'll be snoozing your way through the second period, and all of a sudden you hear something and you look up, and yeah, sure enough, two guys are squaring off. I think the fans still enjoy the fighting part of it. Now it's not something they like to say out loud because it's not very politically correct to say it. And look, I'm not one of those guys, middle-aged guys that wants the 20-year-old guys to go out and throw punches on my behalf because because I'm too I'm too wimpy to go out there and do it myself. I mean, look, I don't want to force anybody to go and fight who doesn't want it. I'm not the one getting the concussions; they are. And so, it's a really fine line you walk between promoting it and decelerating fighting in hockey. And I think, look, fighting is on the decline for sure. But there still is that part of the game where you do have to have a response. So if somebody runs your goalie, you can't just stand around pretending it didn't happen. You got to go after those players, and the good teams do that. By and large, the good teams will do that. They'll stick together and they'll figure it out, and they'll go after people. And the Kraken, I think the Kraken are a good team, but I think sometimes they need a little reminder about that. And they don't have guys that'll necessarily snap the minute that happens. They'll be thinking guys who'll take 5 seconds and they'll go, oh, did that guy really just run my guy? And then by the time they try to get in on it, it's too late. So they could probably work a little more on their hair trigger, I would say.
Yeah, I agree with you. The thought occurs, you were mentioning injury, and the thought occurs that with Jordan Eberle just getting injured, with that, apparently a skate cut his leg.
Yeah, it's Jaden
This is
Schwartz stepped on a puck, lost his balance, went flying, and the skate went right into Eberle's quad, and apparently cut it deep. I haven't seen what happened today, but that's what Ron Francis let me know the other day. So, it was a pretty deep cut, and so that hurt.
with that with that. It reminded me of a story that was run in the Seattle Times actually. That some of our players, like Yanni Gord, are wearing Kevlar, like turtleneck sweaters or something like that.
Yeah, I heard about that story too because I wrote it. That was my story.
Okay, it's you.
No, they do. They've had these kinds of sweaters with Kevlar or other cut resistant material for years. I mean, they've been designing these especially for people, mostly for people in the amateur levels, because the pros don't want to wear them. So yeah, people at the amateur level can wear that. It covers your neck. Sorry.
Is it a macho thing? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, part of it's a macho thing. It's a little of both. It's comfort and it's macho ness. I think players throughout NHL history. It didn't just start now. You can go back 80 years, 100 years. Whenever there's a new piece of safety equipment that's introduced, whether it's goalie masks, helmets, face shields, visors, whatever you want to call them, it always takes time for them to get accepted and integrated. And there's always a bit of there's always people looking over their shoulder and saying, what a wuss that guy is for wearing that kind of stuff. And that's been throughout NHL history. That's gone. Can you imagine being a goalie trying to stop a 90-mile-an-hour puck without a mask on? I mean, it was insane. But they played that way for years. And, goalies would have their faces all stitched up. And finally, Jacques Plante of the Canadiens in 1959 said, you know what, heck with this. He had just gotten his face cut by a shot. And he went in the dressing room and said, I'm using this mask I've been wearing in practice. And the coach was mad at him. All the players were like making, rolling their eyeballs at him. But, I mean, that got it all started. And so this is the same thing. I think it's going to, unfortunately, it took a player dying overseas. Adam Johnson, a former NHL player, died in a pro game in England. He was playing. He got cut in the throat by an opponent's skate. And that's not the first time that's happened. It's happened in the NHL. It happened 35 years ago in the NHL. And so, that's it's been a long time coming.
My gosh, yeah, give me that Kevlar then. If you're gonna get
well, look, and the problem is, and I get it. I mean, Vince Dunn showed me he wears socks to protect his Achilles tendon and his feet area, in case a skate comes flying in there and cuts the back of his calf or whatever. And so he wears, these cut resistant socks. But as he said to me, like, what are you gonna do? Like, outfit yourself like you're going to look like Megatron going out there, in body armor to play hockey. I mean, so Eberle got cut in the leg, in the quad, where there's no protection. I mean, like, so how much of your body do you have to cover up in order to make it safe? And that's been, that's an argument some players have made. And it's not just about being macho. The comfort thing is a real thing. Some players get distracted by the comfort level or the lack of comfort of a turtleneck. And at the pro level, when you're trying to, win these $1 million contracts, sometimes, if anything distracts you and distracts your production from your production, players aren't going to wear it, and especially if they're superstitious, they're not going to wear it. And so, that's played into it as well. But I think it's going to change now. I think you've slowly seen some players integrating it, and I think it's going to take time. But I think the more players that do it, the more players will follow. It'll probably take years, though, before it becomes a common practice, I would say.
Right on. With Yanni out, we brought up Shane Wright from the uh, Coachella Firebirds, right?
Yeah.
And he's 19. We saw him a little bit last year. Do you have any kind of scouting report on this guy? Is he was the third rounder, right?
No, he's a first rounder. He was drafted number 4 overall. Actually, for 2 years, everybody thought he was going to be the number 1 guy drafted. And then he didn't play a lot because of COVID one year, and then he came back after that 1 year layoff, and he had a good season, but not a dazzling standout season like everybody thought he'd be having at that point. And so his draft stock dropped a little bit. He got taken 4th overall by the Kraken, which was the Kraken were thrilled. They never dreamed that they would get Shane Wright.
Okay.
Problem is he's 18 years old. He was 18 when they drafted him. Not many 18-year-olds can play in the NHL. It's very tough to do, even the best. Ron Francis is a Hall of Famer, and I think he made his debut when he was 21, I'm pretty sure. So for the Hartford Whalers back in 1981, 82, I think, 81. So, that's your barometer. Shane Wright's 18. Look, he's a centerman, which is good. I mean, you want to get a good centerman. Ron Francis was a centerman. It's a lot harder to get centers because they have defensive responsibilities. They have to see the whole ice. They have to kind of dictate the course of offensive play. It's not the same as being a winger, a left or a right wing. And a lot of centermen get converted to left or right wing at the NHL level because they're not good enough. So he's a centerman. So they're hoping he works out. Speaking of working out, he's gotten a lot bigger in the last year. But the problem is there's a rule which says that if you're 18 or 19 and you're drafted out of the major junior hockey system in Canada, which he was, and that includes teams here in Seattle like the Everett Silvertips and the Seattle Thunderbirds, they play in the Canadian major junior system. They're part of an umbrella group. So if you're 18 or 19 and you're drafted from that league and you're sent back by your NHL team, you can't go to the AHL. You can't go to pro hockey. You have to go back to your junior team until you turn 20 years old in that season. And Shane Wright just missed the cutoff. Well, he didn't miss it last year. He missed the cutoff by a lot last year.
Didn't they make an exception for that?
No, well, they did this year. Last year, they couldn't make the exception. So they kept him for an 8-game trial period, and then they had to send him back at that point. And they had to send him to junior hockey. And then he did get to go to the AHL, but it was in the playoffs because once his junior team got eliminated, then he was eligible to play in the AHL, and he did participate in the playoffs. The rule exists to protect the junior hockey franchises because they're for-profit enterprises, and the owners didn't want. They got sick and tired of seeing all their drafted superstars go to the NHL and not even get used and get sent to the minors right away. So they said, you're hurting our franchises. You're killing us. We're your feeder system. And so that's why they made the rule. It's been around for 40 years. But this year they made an exception because Wright only missed the cutoff by 5 days. He's got a January 5th birthday. December 31st of any given year is the cutoff to turn 20. Missed it by 5 days. Plus, he would have already had an exception had COVID not come around. And he missed, I think, playing, you have to play 4 junior seasons. And he missed having what would have been his 4th last year had it not been for COVID. He missed it by 1 game, the eligibility, because his team got swept in the playoffs, and they were supposed to be a cup favorite that year in junior. So a lot of exceptions. They made it for him. They're not going to go making a blanket exception for everybody else. So now he's playing in the AHL. Long story short, is off to a great start. 4 goals, 2 assists, doing very well. And so they called him up on an emergency basis because of injuries.
So is this faster than they wanted to bring him up then?
I think so, yeah, I do. Although, like I said, he's off to a very good start. He's doing everything he had to do at Coachella Valley. He had a very good training camp. He had a very solid, good training camp. The problem is this is a playoff team last season. They've got some guys that they've brought in to tweak things with the team. But, I mean, they don't want to disrupt the playoff vibe that they had going. Now they've had some injuries and they're not off to a good start. But all that aside, they like the playoff team they had last year, and Wright was really going to have to stand on his head to make the team out of camp. But he's gone down, and they want him to have pro exposure. He didn't really get the pro exposure last year. It's different playing against professionals versus playing against juniors versus being a college star in football. There's a huge difference between the college level and the NFL. There's a huge difference between being a high school star in baseball and playing professional baseball.
Yeah.
And it's the same in hockey. The junior ranks versus the professional ranks are night and day, and a lot of it's got to do with physical ability. You're playing against grown men, and when you're 18, it's just hard to play against grown men right away.
Is there an opportunity when Eberle comes back that he goes down to Coachella Valley, or is it like baseball? You can only send him up and down X amount of times.
Shane Wright. No, it is like baseball, but Shane Wright's got an exemption. You have an exemption for your first. I think it's your first 2 professional seasons. That's at the minor league level. Like what they don't want is teams to start losing 18 and 19-year-old guys. So they do protect you. You get that exemption for the first couple of seasons that you're in the pros, and then after that it applies to you. So the Kraken have a few players like that. Ryan Winterton, who's also up, is in the same boat. He's exempt. He's waiver exempt, and so that's not going to be an issue with those 2 guys.
Okay. Switching gears, I was Brandon Tanev. He's kind of my favorite because he's a character, and he's got a little bit of a cult hero status with me and some of my friends. There's a guy that the Kraken picked up, former Spokane Chief Kaylor Yamamoto, and he's like a whole local hero too. And he's getting a lot of press on the internet, like as far as message boards. A lot of people are really digging him. Where did he come from, and do you expect him to be a major player on this team?
Well, he played for the Spokane Chiefs, and then he was the second highest drafted Washington player in history in the NHL draft. I think he went 22nd or 21st overall. He was taken by the Edmonton Oilers in 2017, and he went to the Oilers. The Oilers are a star-studded team. They have 2 of the best players in the world, Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl. And so, but Yamamoto was sticking up there. He was getting second line action, got a lot of exposure. Had some injuries the last year and a half, and his production slowed. And finally, the Oilers got to a point where they're in a bit of a salary cap crunch. So they had a lot of talented players that they had to pay and keep satisfied, and they were running out of room in their salary cap pool to make everybody happy. And so Yamamoto was coming up on free agency, and they had to make decisions somewhere. And so they traded him to Detroit in the summer. He never played a game for Detroit, but they traded him so they could at least get an asset back rather than lose him for nothing as a free agent, because they knew they weren't going to be able to re-sign him. And then he didn't sign with Detroit. He went back into the free agency pool, and that's where the Kraken picked him up for a $1.5 million 1-year deal. So, I mean, look, he comes here. If he rediscovers some of his scoring touch, and he's already shown flashes of it on the power play and in a handful of games, if he can rediscover a bit of his touch, that they'll maybe get a bargain player out of it, a guy that slots in a lot higher than the $1.5 million they're paying him. And if he's not, if he's just an average 4th line guy, then they can let him go next year, no harm, no foul, and not really bust the salary cap this year. So it's kind of like a potential, medium risk, high reward, or low risk, high reward potential situation there. I think they're looking at.
Question for you: as I look at what we did this offseason, we talked about Yamamoto. It to the average guy like me, it didn't look like we did much as far as getting a star to come in here. And I just started thinking about the Mariners, where it's like, you guys gonna bolster this team a little bit? Because we went to the playoffs last year. I feel like maybe just a few more pieces and this team's a contender. Is that just not their philosophy to go out and get a big signing?
No, well, look, so I've seen these comparisons with the Mariners already, and nobody knows the Mariners and their spending patterns the way I do. I became known back in the day for criticizing the Mariners for their lack of spending before it became fashionable in the year 2023, apparently. This didn't just happen this past season. But the difference between Major League Baseball and the National Hockey League is the NHL has a salary cap. And so, it's not like even if the Kraken wanted to, they could go out and spend to the hilt and do whatever they want with their money. They can't. They're financially restricted, and they're already pushing against the cap. They've already spent about as much as they actually can spend as far as cap rules go. So there's no comparison that way with the Mariners. Whereas the Mariners play in a league where they have some that they have thresholds that you can't go over, but it's not the same as a hard cap. And so for years, the Mariners could have spent as much as any of the teams in baseball. They chose not to. That's a difference. The Kraken have spent almost as much money as they're physically allowed to spend in
Right.
hockey this season, and so that's part of the issue. The second part is they had Andre Burakovsky coming back off a season-ending injury that he suffered last February. He tore his groin muscle, so he was coming back. And when he went out, when he got hurt, he was leading the team in points. So they figured they were getting back the equivalent of a high-end free agent anyway. And they've already got 4 years left on his contract. I mean, so that's a pretty big free agent deal right there. So they figured that's going to bolster the team. They went to the playoffs without him last season. So they figure that's going to be an automatic boost. They figured they would see a boost from Matty Beniers. They were hoping to see a boost from Ellie Tolvanen. He got off to a slow start, but he's picking it up lately. And so we'll just have to see. And they were hoping for an improvement as well from Vince Dunn offensively to build off of that really great season, the team MVP season he had last year. They figure with all that, they should be okay. The other problem is, the big problem the team had is they have all these young guys coming in. Shane Wright, you mentioned already. Ryan Winterden's up, playing for them right now. And then you've got, but beyond there, you have Ty Cartier, who started the season with the team. You got Riker Evans, a defenseman, who's probably going to be on the team at some point this year. So they had to let a bunch of guys go in the summertime in order to make room for these folks. And so they've got the room there now, but they let a bunch of guys go that scored a lot of goals on their fourth line. Guys like Daniel Sprung, Ryan Donato, Morgan Geekie. So they all left. Carson Soucy left, and he was a pretty good defenseman. But they had to let these guys go in order to free up spots so that these young players could be integrated in within the team. And the hope is that these young players will be better than the ones eventually that they replace. The problem is we're in the eventually part right now. We're in the wait and see part. So fans are going to have to, unfortunately, be a little patient. I'm not asking them to, but that's the reality of the situation. Fans can do whatever they want. If they don't want to be patient, they don't have to be. But this is the situation that we're in. We got to wait for these guys to actually acclimate a bit and start learning the NHL game before they're actually going to surpass the NHL season guys that they replace. So it's a bit of a step back situation for the Kraken, and that's why. But it's got nothing to do with money.
Okay. Good to hear, because I was a little bit worried there.
No. I mean, look, if there's any guy in the city that's going to blow the whistle on a team for spending, it's going to be me. It's not going to be anybody else. So if I'm not doing it, you can rest assured that it's not a factor.
That's a guarantee. Awesome. Thank
Yeah.
you. Got a question for you about the January 1st game, the outdoor game at T-Mobile Park. I kind of wonder, I'm trying to figure out, like what's going to shake this town and what's going to get it, bumping for the Kraken. And I think that could be a major landmark moment. I guess it already sold out. Tickets were expensive. I didn't
It's
buy one,
hockey.
but I think this might really be an event.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's I people have asked me about it. I would say it's kind of like a cross between. It's a bit like an all-star game in baseball. It's a little less than it's a lot less than a Super Bowl, but it's up there as in terms of major sports events. Maybe it would be kind of like the Sounders hosting the MLS Cup Championship back in 2009. That was 19, not 19. God, where the decades are flying by on me. Every time I blink, another decade goes by. But yeah, 2019, the Sounders hosted the MLS Cup Championship here in Seattle, and that was a pretty big deal. That was a big event. So I think it'll be something right along those lines, maybe a cross between that and an All-Star game. It's a very popular thing. I'm curious to see how they're going to outfit T-Mobile Park. I know they're going to have partial slats covering the roof, but they're going to leave an open roof space to a degree over the ice rink throughout the week. What they don't want is for it to start pouring rain and for the ice to get terrible. And so if that happens, they can always close off that section, but leave open air slats in other parts of the stadium to give it an outdoor feel. That's kind of the idea of what they're going to do. But yeah, I'm hoping for it. I got my fingers crossed for them that it's going to be a big event. It's a big event for Seattle. Seattle's had some huge sports events lately. They hosted the All-Star. We hosted the All-Star game here. Now we're going to have this event coming up. And then we also have, World Cup soccer coming up here in a couple of years. I
Oh
mean,
yeah.
these are some big time events for Seattle. I mean, I think we're getting to the point where we can start arguing that Seattle should host a Super Bowl at some point. I'd like to see that happen. I don't see any reason why we can't. Uh,
That was
and they have terrible weather down south too nowadays, so I don't see any reason why they can't host a Super
well.
Bowl in Seattle. It's more about the events leading up to the game than the game itself, anyway. So what if they have to play in some cold weather? I
Well,
don't.
yeah. The Colts versus Bears was in a monsoon in Miami. Like
Yeah, I
we don't.
remember that. Devin Hester ran back. What was it? The opening kickoff for a touchdown, didn't he?
Yeah.
Or no? Peyton Manning threw a TD on the first play of the game, and then Devin Hester ran the ensuing kickoff back like 100 yards for a TD. So that was and the rest of the game was
Kind of a boring game. It was kind of a boring game.
it was
I
kind
mean,
of boring. Yeah, the rain kind of ruined it. But I mean, yeah, it was a monsoon. So how bad's the weather going to get here? Well, actually, I'm looking
right.
outside. You don't want to answer that question.
It'll be
But
45 in light rain. I mean, that's what it'll be.
I mean, it's football for crying out loud. Go ask Bronco Nagurski and the Chicago Bears. If they cared about the weather when they were playing the Washington Redskins in the NFL championships back in the 40s, or go ask the Green Bay Packers and Dallas Cowboys about their NFL title game. What
Right. Well,
was it?
CX versus Vikings a couple years ago, they didn't care about the fans or the players.
No, they
Playing
didn't care. I almost went to that game, actually. They almost sent me to that game to do a story on the fans. I would have frozen to death, so I wouldn't be here talking to you right now.
I think that was a good call not to go.
It was a good call. Yeah, dying's not so good. Yeah.
Got a question for you about the Kraken in general. I know one of the things I've been complaining about, and I read an article from you last year, that the Kraken weren't doing a great job with the root sports. For example, people in Spokane couldn't get the Kraken. They didn't this time last year. They didn't have a streaming app. That streaming app's like less than a year old. But they seem to get that turned around, and I think that's been really ingratiating the Kraken with a lot of fans or potential fans. Yes, no.
If we had 2 hours, we could get into the whole discussion about where regional sports networks are going. Look, the bottom line is, from where I see it, where I look, they're not reaching enough fans with root sports. It's expensive, and it's not because of root sports necessarily. It's like the cable providers also charge a lot of money to carry them, and they're right now Comcast Xfinity is just up the price of the root sport. They included root sports on their highest tier package, and so they've upped the price by at least $18, maybe more for some people. That's per month, and so people don't want to pay that. Um, and this isn't just happening with root sports; it's happening all over the country with regional sports networks, with RSNs. We'll call them to shorten it. And so people are trying a bunch of stuff. Look, if you're asking me, I think part of the future, what you're going to see, you're always starting to see it in some markets. I think you're going to see more and more teams go back to the future. You're going to see more and more teams going towards regular broadcast channels and foregoing the whole regional sports network deal. What I mean is, maybe they'll start putting their games on Q13 Fox now, and or Kong TV or something like that. And
Right.
that's what they're doing in places like Vegas. They're doing it in Arizona. They're doing it in more sports beyond hockey. The difference, hockey's in a unique position. Hockey, you're in a position where teams aren't making the kind of broadcast money revenue that you are in sports like baseball. And so if you say you're going to forego your RSN deal and experiment with something, well, you're not making that much money anyway. I think the average deal in hockey is something like $15 to $30 million. Last time I saw that's sort of the range it falls in between per year that teams are making. I mean, in baseball, you see teams up in the 50 million and higher range. And you get up to those levels, or $100 million in some cases. You get up to those levels, it's tough to say, hey, we're just going to write this off and put our stuff over broadcast TV. Because with broadcast TV, when you do that, you don't get a subscriber revenue. And that's the difference. With RSNs, with regional sports networks, you're charging people per month, per channel that they're watching. And so you can make a lot more subscriber revenue with that model than you can putting it for free on broadcast. There is no subscriber revenue. It's free TV. You stick an antenna on your roof, you got it. Where you make the money there is through advertising. And so what you have to do when you're doing that, if you're going to make that gamble, and I think hockey teams are in a position to take this chance, whereas, like I said, baseball teams, it's a little tougher to ask. But you put your stuff for free, maybe the Kraken will all of a sudden up their viewership by 10 times. You get 10 times the viewers.
Right.
We saw that during the playoffs. They had games for free on some of the national networks, and the Kraken viewership was up tenfold. And so that if I'm an executive looking at that from a hockey perspective, I would say like, wow, that's the kind of numbers where we could actually make ad revenue that's very similar to what we're having. But here's the bonus: maybe you don't make as much money up front, maybe you forego a little of that, but you build your fan base, you build your audience, and a team like the Kraken needs as many eyeballs as they can on them. And so somebody tells you you can up your audience tenfold. I think that's something you have to look at. They've still got 2 years to go with their Root Sports deal beyond this season. But I mean, everything's changing so fast in the industry. I mean, RSNs are imploding left and right, and so yeah, if I had to bet money, I would say you might not see that deal come to its fruition.
What,
If
about lift?
I had to be a betting man.
Gotcha. What about lifting the blackout on the NHL app?
Well, look, blackouts exist for a reason. Um, that's a little tougher to do. They're trying to get people to pay for their services, right? And so if you're giving, and they're trying to get people also to go to games locally, and so people pay for certain rights. It depends which blackouts you're talking about. If you're talking about home blackouts, uh,
Yes.
are you talking about that?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I mean they exist for a reason. And so the NHL, you go to a lot of arenas and they're not full. They might say there's X amount of people in the arenas, but the arenas aren't full yet. And so, it's a really fine line that you're walking between giving them the game for free and then wanting them to pay the money, because ticket revenue is still a big deal in hockey. You want them to go out and buy those games and buy the tickets and go sit in the games. And so, yeah, a lot of times they won't give you that stuff for free. Plus, they're not going to give you the stuff for free here in Seattle if Root Sports paid a bunch of money to get the broadcast rights. So
Right.
you got to protect the rights holders. I mean, that's the bottom line. It's not as much necessarily the gate. It's about who controls the rights in that market. And so as long as you still have RSNs that are paying you big money for the rights to your games, the leagues have to protect those rights. That's not just a hockey thing. That's in any league out there. You can't look at the NFL. NFL operates a completely different level from every other team, every other league that you're looking at. It's a completely different animal. They've got so much revenue coming in from national broadcast that they don't have to do the local thing with RSNs like they do in the other sports. It's just a completely different comparison.
Gotcha. Got one last. We're getting towards the end here. I got one last
Yeah.
question. This is actually from the Soul Man, Brian Solak. He wants to know about the Rising from the Deep book and how that's going for you.
I mean, it's going great. As you can see, I got a big poster in behind me. I don't know if you can see it, Rising from the Deep. Jerry Bruckheimer with the forward. That's going to be my claim to fame from now on. That I've got Jerry Bruckheimer's name right up there
He's
with mine. That's about the only time that's ever going to happen in the history of the world, by the way. But uh, no, the
that's
sales have gone well. It's gotten nice reviews on Amazon from what I can see. I don't think Bruckheimer's bought the movie rights yet. I'll
okay.
have to give him a call when this is done and see how much he's going to up his offer. But no, I wouldn't necessarily expect that. Although I think Jordan Eberle looks like Jake Gyllenhaal, so he could probably play. Jake Gyllenhaal could probably play Eberle. If you
Who'd play you, Geoff?
Who would play me? Back in the day when I was in better shape, people used to say Charlie Sheen. They used to say Robert Downey Jr. And then
Okay.
sometimes when I put on a little weight, like Mitch Levy, a former KJR radio host, used to say I look like a young Nathan Lane, which I don't think was very complimentary. I like Nathan Lane as an actor, but not necessarily as a physical specimen. And so I will stick with Robert Downey Jr. or Charlie Sheen.
Charlie Sheen. All right.
Although Charlie's had a little bit of a rough go, so maybe a more a stable Charlie Sheen would
Well, I've
be.
read some of your scathing articles in the Times, and you've got tiger blood, Geoff. So I think that's a good selection. We're getting at the end of our show here. As you remember from the past, we always like to finish on an upbeat, a shout out to a friend or a family member or somebody that's made an impression on your life or is you just want to send good wishes to. Do you have a shout out for this week?
For people that have made a difference in my life. Well, I mean, shout out this week, Larry Stone's retiring. from the Seattle Times after a great career run. So I think that's that's somebody I met 20 years ago jogging on a treadmill in New York City. I was working for the Toronto Star. He was working for the Seattle Times. We were both covering the World Series. It would have been it would have been almost 25 years ago, 1999 World Series. So I met him there for the first time, same hotel. We were talking, and I'd meet him all the time in the playoffs after that for years. And then finally, we ended up working together as colleagues. So he's had a great career. So wish him well in his sign off. And I think whoever takes his place is going to have big shoes to fill.
Awesome. And I got to give my shout out to the biggest hockey fan I know, KT Tennyson, who apparently we're going to go to that outdoor game, and it's going to cost us over $200 each. And but it's going to be great to see her again because she moved away just a few years ago, and great to have her back. And then Brian the Soulman Solak, he wants to give a shout out to his parents. He's truly blessed after visiting them last night, and also the Soul Man wants to give a shout out to you, Geoff. We're really grateful. We're closing in on 200 episodes, and it's great to have you be a part of that.
Well, no,
Well,
I'm honored to have been here twice now. So thank you. I know you've had some big guests on this show, and so I appreciate you having me back.
awesome, awesome. Where can people find you? You're still with the Seattle Times, right?
As far as I know, I have to check. So you never know. Checks in the mail, they tell me. No, yeah,
That's
I'm still with the Seattle Times. You can look me up on Twitter at Geoff Baker Times, and it's really original name, I know, but that's it. Baker Times. I'm on Instagram at G Baker Writer, I think is my Instagram. I'm not as good at Instagram as I probably should be. I'm on Facebook also. I've got like a million Facebook pages, so pick one, and you'll eventually find the one that I actually post to. But yeah, no, I need to find me at the Seattle Times. Just Google Geoff Baker, Seattle Times, and wade through all the curse words directed my way on the internet, and then you'll actually find my page. Me there.
Fantastic. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us this week at the Seattle Sports Union podcast. Keep in touch with us on social media on Facebook and Twitter at Seattle Sports U. As well, check out our newly redesigned website, seattlesportsunion.com, and keep listening to our podcast on Spotify, iTunes, Captivate FM, and now on North Beach Community TV, Channel 68. Once again, thank you, Geoff Baker, for being on the show. And on behalf of the soul man, Brian Solak, who's producing the show today, and Matt Page, we'll see you guys next time.